It's time for the Bible. We don't really know for sure what is and what is not. Holy Ghost, God, baby, God blasted my spot. Ghost, yes, friends, it's time for the Bible.
Could it be time for the Bible Geek again already? What a pest I am. A pest by the name of Robert M. Price. And just wanted to give you a little news. My book, what the heck is it now? Moses and Monotheism is going to be out in a few weeks now, finally, and I think you're really going to get a kick out of it. I'm hard at work on my book, Holy Fable, the Bible Undistorted by Faith. Boy, am I having fun with that, and I think you will too as you read it. Just finished a super long chapter on the Deuteronomic history. You know, that's Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Oh boy, what fun that was. Now I'm going to start on the Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah. So much for that. This is from Pyrrho of Kentucky. Pyrrho, the ancient Pyrrho, of course, the founder of the Skeptics. Okay, despite my better judgment, I've been involved in a conservative Bible study. I have found it fascinating how they use presupposition and group self-selection to present the Bible as one cohesive prophetic whole, all the while misusing the mythic genera for proof of empirical facts. In the most recent class, we finished reviewing the book of Isaiah. The teacher pointed out Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12 as prophetical of the Gospels, and cited that liberals had put this notion into doubt by suggesting a late date for Isaiah's composition. But that with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the date for Isaiah's composition has had to be pushed to an earlier date. Well, my BS detector, of course I guess it stands for Bullgeschichte, went off, and I decided to write you in order to get your take on the following questions. One, from one conservative point of view, how would the Dead Sea Scrolls provide an early date for Isaiah, and what would be the counter-argument for a late date? Well, it's really impossible to know when the book was written. If any of it does go back to Isaiah of Jerusalem, assuming there was such a person, as there may well have been, who knows, then that would place it in the 8th century, some of it. And as I'm sure you know, Isaiah is divided by modern critics into 3 sections. There's the so-called First Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39, and again, many believe that there are some genuine Isaiah of Jerusalem oracles in that. Then Second Isaiah would have been written during the exile, right at the end of it, on the eve of it being over, and it's aimed at those Jews who are about to go to the Holy Land from the Persian Empire. This is chapters 40 through 55. Most of that seems to be the work of a single author. Then there's the third Isaiah, or Trito Isaiah, second Isaiah, called Deutero Isaiah, which just means second Isaiah. So Trito Isaiah, that is a post-exilic work. The setting it presupposes, the issues it addresses, the people it addresses, the problems going on, make it pretty clear that its audience is back from the exile. It kind of seems, though, that that's a catch-all work by several popular prophets during that time, not all by even a single one, and to some degree representing somewhat different emphases, one more legalistic than others, and so on. This would be in the 5th century BCE, the 400s and so on. more or less the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Then there's so that's broadly how it's dated by critics. I think the person in this Bible study had things mixed up a bit. None of this, all of these parts of Isaiah, as dated by critics, are well before Christianity. It's not like someone is saying, not even I say that Isaiah is a CE or an AD work. That's not the case. So it's impossible that... and of course the Dead Sea Scrolls copy of Isaiah, this huge scroll, is itself BCE. There's no way Christians fabricated this, right? So what I think this person is thinking of is that if you divide Isaiah into first and second, and third's not relevant to this, that explodes the notion that a reference to Cyrus, the Persian emperor, as God's anointed, is a futuristic prediction by Isaiah of Jerusalem. Right? In his day, the Assyrians were still around, still had the Babylonian Empire and then the Persian Empire to go. Well, if Isaiah is naming Cyrus as his anointed, and there is a Cyrus who is good to the Jews and so on, that sounds like a nice predictive prophecy. But if that occurs in second Isaiah, as indeed it does, it's not a prediction, and of course it's not some kind of scheme or fraud. There's nothing about a prediction like one day an emperor named Cyrus will come to the... No, it just presupposes that God's great champion is Cyrus the Persian, a contemporary of the second Isaiah. That's what they're thinking of, and that's one reason that conservatives didn't like the higher criticism of Isaiah, because it deprived them of what they thought was a predictive prophecy. That's not the... nobody's trying to chip away at the possibility of predictive prophecy by positing that there's a second Isaiah contemporary with Cyrus. There's all kinds of internal evidence, there's stylistic factors and so on. Outside of fundamentalist spin doctors, nobody goes along with the unity of Isaiah anymore, except on the other end, right? There are people that say that we only have any Isaiahs because somebody later in the day who was a fan of Deutero or Trito Isaiah got the idea from them to add stuff ostensibly by Isaiah of Jerusalem. Like there wasn't a book of Isaiah until the second Isaiah came along, and then people decided to add these earlier works to it. So I think he's just got his facts mixed up there. What fundamentalists usually crow about in connection with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so I tried to make it clear that the Dead Sea Scrolls do not challenge the conventional critical dating of the three sections of Isaiah. That really has nothing to do with that. This manuscript is much later than anybody's estimate of when the last part of Isaiah was written. So it doesn't, the fact of this manuscript doesn't upset theories about Isaiah. Well, what they usually crow about, to get back there, is that the Dead Sea Scrolls Isaiah is, along with the other Qumran biblical manuscripts, is nearly a millennium earlier than the previously earliest texts, the Masoretic texts, which come from the late Middle Ages, right? And nobody thought that the Old Testament was new as of that date, right? Everybody's always known that, oh yeah, these are hundreds and hundreds of years old, the Masoretic texts. But the question was, has the text been grossly distorted from the time of original writing to the Masoretic texts we have? There's plenty of time for it to have happened. But they already kind of knew that there hadn't been wholesale fabrication and alteration and rewriting, because the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, was we have much earlier manuscripts and of that. And they, in turn, were based on much earlier Hebrew texts, more or less contemporary with the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you can check the translation, and sometimes it's a bit free. But we already kind of knew there couldn't have been huge changes. I mean, 1 Samuel is a bit shorter in the Greek or the Hebrew underlying it. The book of Jeremiah is a bit different. About a fifth of that is missing if you compare the Septuagint to the Masoretic text or the Dead Sea Scrolls. What it did show was that it hadn't been grossly distorted. Okay, but we knew that. And it did show, however, that the text had been preserved in different recensions, different versions, that different editors did put their stamp on it in terms of readings here and there, particular verses and sentences. And often it turns out that the Hebrew from which the Septuagint was translated read more like the newly discovered pretty much BC AD era Dead Sea Scrolls, and so both of them are more accurate than the medieval Masoretic texts. But so they make too much of a big deal about this. Apologists like to say, yeah, the Isaiah scroll from Qumran makes it clear that the text was passed along with absolute fidelity. I wouldn't go that far, but there was general fidelity, but everybody already knew that from comparing it with the Septuagint. So it's not that big a deal. It was a great thing to have all these much older manuscripts, again, nearly 1,000 years older, that came from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there are a couple of interesting surprises in there, but it's not as big a deal, or it's not the kind of big deal that fundamentalist apologists make it. I think this person just didn't remember what he had read some time before. Let's see. Then the second question, would you agree that regardless of the authorship date of Isaiah, the gospel authors could have just decided to write a new Isaiah 52:13 to 53:12? You mean that it could be an interpolation by Christians? That really can't be, because we have these earlier manuscripts that already have it. The issue is this supposed to be read as a prediction of the Messiah, whoever he might turn out to be, or of Jesus and as the Messiah and his suffering? And I think that can't be. If you want to look at it as a prediction of Jesus, you got to retreat into this what Raymond Brown and the Catholics called sensus plenior, a fuller sense beyond the literal sense. Because there's no way that just reading it straightforwardly as part of Isaiah or the second Isaiah, that it's predicting anybody. Most of it's in the past tense. There's nothing to indicate this has to do with a coming Messiah, much less Jesus. It talks about some figure who suffers for the sins of the people of Israel, and yet will see vindication. But there is ready to hand a pre-Christian Sitzum Leben for this, namely the humiliation exaltation ritual for the king, done every year, just as it was done in Babylon and other area countries. It was part of the renewal of the mandate of heaven, and it's now in a way there's a kind of a connection in that much of the early Christology of Jesus as the Christ and what that would have denoted to the ancients, the Son of God, like the King was the Son of God, and his ritualized, you might say, mock suffering for the people each year as part of the renewal of nature and of kingly authority. So yeah, a lot of New Testament Christology does reflect very old royal ideology of the King of Judah. But as for it being a prediction, one day the Messiah is going to come and he's going to suffer, you just have to read that through Christian lenses. You can't, I mean, you have to take it as some sort of concealed message that becomes visible only to the eye of faith. It's not just an objective, naked fact that would make you have faith. Holy mackerel, look at this prediction of Jesus. Well, look, that can't be a coincidence. No, that just doesn't work. So thanks, Piro. Rightly a skeptic. Okay. Oh, this is kind of a long one. Who wrote this? Let's see, Loretto Taylor. Yeah, all right. Faithful listener. I have a question about the rise of the monotheistic Yahweh cult and child sacrifice. Throughout the Old Testament, there's much concern about women leading their husbands away from the worship of the one true God and into idolatry. Marriages to foreign women were prohibited lest the men adopt the worship of their wives' favored deities. In the book of Jeremiah, Jerry remonstrates with the women in exile in Egypt because they had resumed making offerings to the Queen of Heaven after being driven out of Judah. In light of this, I can't help but wonder if the prohibition of child sacrifice was an attempt at getting the women folk on board with the Yahweh cult worship. The Yahweh cult. Worship Yahweh and only Yahweh, and you don't have to hand your babies over to the priests to be killed. What think ye? That, I must say, I don't quite buy. Ezekiel admits what the Book of the Covenant in Exodus mandates, that the firstborn son of any mother was to be sacrificed to God just like the firstborn of a livestock animal was on the 8th day, I believe it is. And so, yeah, they did once have infant sacrifice to Yahweh, and they also sacrificed infants to Molech, the god of the subterranean fire chasm at the foot of Mount Zion. That's pretty clear. And so there were pagan and Yahweh infant sacrifices. Eventually, of course, they dropped this, and that's one of the purposes of the Abraham nearly sacrificing Isaac's story, to say, okay, you don't have to sacrifice your firstborn anymore. You can sacrifice a lamb or a ram instead. So the Yahweh cult was not the only one who did it, but they did. So depending on when you're talking about, trying to just stick with Yahweh wouldn't necessarily have made your kids safe from infant sacrifice. I would suggest that L. Sprague de Camp, the great writer about ancient history and all manner of scientific matters, and a terrific science fiction and fantasy novelist, whom I had the pleasure to know, de Camp has this terrific adventure novel set in the Persian Empire. It's called The Dragon of the Ishtar Gate. And in it, his heroes, they're sent on a mission by the Emperor of Persia, and they're making their way down to Africa. And they stop in Jerusalem for a while, and they happen to be talking to some guy who's a priest of Baal, I guess, and this guy tells them, I'm on hard times here because the Yahweh priests are trying to corner the market. So if everybody worships their God, everybody's offering the sacrifices, and their priests are getting fat on it. We're not getting any of them anymore. So was monotheism partly a result of monopolism? Could be. Anyway, Back to Loretto. And on the subject of Jeremiah, when he reprimands the exiled women for resuming their worship of the Queen of Heaven, they point out to him that everything was fine and dandy as long as they'd been offering cakes to her. And when they stopped, per Jeremiah's threats of God's wrath, their lives went to hell in a cheap handbasket. It seems that the people, particularly the women, had obeyed, stopped making the idolatrous offerings, and God had gone ahead and punished them anyway. What would be the justification for God punishing the people for their idolatry, even after they had ceased the idolatrous practices? I must say, Reuven has taken a whack at this one, and I found his answer unsatisfactory. Yeah, I haven't followed that. I don't know what Reuven said about it. My hunch is that the rejoinder would be it's too little too late, because that is kind of the way they viewed Josiah's Reformation in the Deuteronomic history in 2 Kings. It's like they fish up this book of the law, and Hilkiah the priest hands it to him, and Josiah has it read before him, and here's what you ought to do to avoid the curse of God, Israel, and if you don't, they'll be held to pay. And he listens to this and says, oh my gosh, we're sunk. I wish I'd have known this. And so quickly he tries to shut down all the high places, the local hilltop altars, and eliminate the worship of other gods and all that. And what happens? Does he fend off the decline and defeat of Judah by the Babylonian Empire? No, but he's told, nice try. The prophets tell him God is going to stave it off until you're gone, but I'm afraid it's too late to change the fate which your predecessors have sealed. I'm guessing that would have been the reasonable thing. I'm sorry, you should have thought of this earlier. By the way, the Queen of Heaven was no doubt understood to be Yahweh's queen, and because 2/3 of the time that the temple in Jerusalem allegedly stood, Asherah was worshipped there, the Queen of Heaven, alongside Yahweh. Reformist kings would kick her out, and then the next guy would bring her back in, and she was in there most of the time. So in a way, it wasn't really a denial of the Yahweh religion. It was just adhering to the traditional polytheistic version of it. And on the subject of the Queen of Heaven, it is apparent that Asherah was widely worshipped by both Israelites and Judahites. I've seen some speculation that at this time Asherah was considered Yahweh's consort. Oh, sorry, should have read this before. Being as how in Canaanite mythology, Asherah was the consort of El, and Yahweh was only a minor deity in the Canaanite pantheon, if indeed he was a Canaanite deity and not an import. Well, one text, one Ugaritic text has El say, my son is Yah. So apparently he was. How could this be? Asherah would presumably have been Yahweh's mother. If she wasn't, would there have been some kind of mythic overthrow of El with Yahweh claiming Asherah as his own? I've also wondered if Asherah at that time may have ceased to be a personal name of a deity and became a generic term for Mrs. God. But considering that in Israel, Judah, and many other Semitic cultures, the mother, not the wife of the king, would have been queen, is it likely that in those times Asherah would have held the position of the divine queen mother? Yeah, you have a real good question there. Baal's wife was Anat. And she's mentioned in the Old Testament too. My guess is that Asherah became understood as the wife of God once the Deuteronomic reform had combined Yahweh and El. But it's hard to say. Who knows? There's an interesting book on this I read some time ago, but don't quite remember anymore. But according to the neighboring pattern, Asherah should have been the wife of El or El Elyon, and but could just be. These goddesses were pretty much synonymous anyway. Like in Greece, you have Aphrodite, Hera, Athena, Artemis, and they're all slightly different versions of one another, which means they were originally equivalent local goddesses. And when the different city-states came to have more contact, they began to think what all ancient peoples did in a situation like that. Gee, I guess our goddess is the same as yours, just another name. The three daughters of Allah that were worshipped in Mecca, Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Al-Manat, were mother gods and star gods and so on. They're pretty much the same. No doubt they just, in that case, they didn't quite go as far as to identify them, but it's the same idea that you had equivalent goddesses. Ishtar, Astarte, and so Isis are all the same. And whether anybody connects the dots or not, and so that may be why there's this confusion between them. And finally, in a knockdown, drag-out, no-holds-barred brawl, who do you think would win, Barney or H.R. Pufnstuf? I never saw the latter, but I have seen Barney. I cannot imagine him winning any fight. I'd love to see a 1-second movie, kind of like Bambi versus Godzilla, where you have Barney versus Godzilla. That'd be pretty short work, I should think. Thanks, Loretto. D. Thomas Forthright saith, or asketh, got a few questions here. 1, because they're against God, the powers of sorcerers and demons would have had to have been derived from another God. Do you see this as an example of polytheism in the New Testament? Well, I don't know that I from what I know about Judaism and early Christianity and their view of surviving Mediterranean polytheism, they would have really chalked up the powers of sorcerers to Satan, even though the sorcerers did not, right? Because in 1 Corinthians, in the discussion of meat offered to idols, it says, what the heathen sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons. Like, not wittingly, but that's what they wind up doing. And my guess is that's what they would have thought. Simon, Magus, and so forth were dupes of Satan. And but originally, I think it did go back to polytheism, as you can tell by looking at the surviving Hellenistic magic texts. It's pretty clear, though there were for instance, the idea of casting out demons by Beelzebul. That was a practice where people bound the power of this exorcism god Beelzebul, who was actually a combination of two earlier gods. Baal Molil, Lord of the Ghost World, and Bel Ea, the god of heaven, and they had been combined into an exorcism patron before New Testament times, and so that was originally certainly a mark of being empowered by other gods. But then again, what does the New Testament make of Beelzebul? Well, copyists go on to identify him with Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies, which means an oracle god, and from Philistine Ekron. But Beelzebul was a different one. Still, there were various gods, but the New Testament, of course, chalks them up as sort of avatars of Satan. 2. The New Testament refers to scripture concerning many prophets now lost. The book of Nathan the prophet. I think you mean Old Testament, right? The prophecy of Ahijah, the book of Gad the seer, the visions of Iddo the seer, then in the New Testament, the epistle from Laodicea, which most people think means get in Colossians, why don't you get the epistle I wrote to them from Laodicea? Anyway, the book of Samuel the seer, okay, now we're back to Old Testament, the book of Shemaiah the prophet, the book of Jehu, also, since they were respected by the New Testament authors, let's just say the biblical authors, how can anyone rightly claim to have the whole story now? How is it that no one cared to keep the words of at least 8 of God's own prophets? I think that it's because it was haphazard. I mean, nobody had too many copies of these things, and they eventually were just lost by haphazard copying. Because the writer of Kings might have held the book of Gad the seer in high esteem, but maybe not everybody did. Because think of the great story in Jeremiah where Amaziah, I think, a rival prophet, prophesies. He puts an ox yoke on his shoulders, I think, and or puts it on Jeremiah's shoulders and breaks it. Jeremiah says, hey, get used to the idea. We're going to be enslaved and conquered by Babylon, just like an ox has this yoke. And Amaziah broke the yoke and said, no, God isn't going to let that happen. He's going to liberate us just like this yoke is smashed. And Jeremiah says, amen. I hope it's true, but I know it's not. And he says it's going to be bad news. You'll see. Well, that shows that just because some prophet said it, not everybody would necessarily agree with it, right? And so some people might have thought Gad the seer, yeah, that guy, forget it, some charlatan or something like that. Who knows, though? But there also is another possibility that is not at all unlikely, namely that these works did not exist, that they're created as part of the window dressing by the Old Testament authors to lend a false semblance of antiquity to what they are describing, as if, oh yeah, this is old stuff. I got it from these old records. Does he tell you where to find them? Is there a link? No. So, I mean, it could be that they were real. Like, I think the book of Yashar, or also called the book of Jasher, pronounced differently, the book of the just, that's quoted a couple of times in Joshua and 2 Samuel. It was a bunch of poems about heroes of Israel, in this case Joshua and Saul and Jonathan. That kind of seems like they're quoting a real source, especially since it's not in the same genre as the surrounding material. So who knows? But all these things about, you can read more about King Manasseh and the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah and so forth. What? Hard to say. I don't know. Either option is possible. But it may have existed and even been venerated, but just not been accepted as scripture by whatever group was compiling their own list. Like Ezekiel's place in the canon was questioned, partly because the blueprint of the temple that he gives, the way it should be rebuilt, wasn't used, and so some people said, "What is this? A false prophecy or something?" And so there were doubts about the Song of Solomon and Esther and so forth. Who knows? So it's a good question, but it doesn't really prove that these books didn't exist, though I suspect that is the case. Nobody knoweth. Ooh, let's see. 3. Isaiah 45:5 says, I am Yahweh, and there is no God beside me, which is assumed to mean there are no other gods, when it seems to me the term beside may just as easily be interpreted, no God can stand shoulder to shoulder with me, not that there are none. Could be, but I get the impression that it is a statement of monotheism, that this seems to me to require less interpretation, you might say, to take it as I am Yahweh, the only God. It doesn't weasel like in the Ten Commandments. I'm Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of Egyptian bondage. You shall have no other gods but me. That doesn't rule out that there are any. Indeed, the point is, I'm the one you owe something to, not Baal, not Dagon, not Thoth. I think the second Isaiah is a monotheist. Of course, that's, take a long shot and look at it in perspective. We wind up saying, yes, monotheism has appeared in the evolution of Hebrew religion because of this passage in the second Isaiah. Have to admit, that's kind of slim evidence, but I think it does mean that. I mean, you're right, it's possible it could mean that, but I take it for what that's worth. It's pretty subjective to be a reference to monotheism. 4. How do apologists get around the fact that the wedding was never arranged for Jesus by his family, as was the custom? If he were a real Jewish man, and especially if also a rabbi, he should have been married with children. Might we consider this a sign of docetism? Getting into Da Vinci Code territory there. This was argued with a lot of trumpets and drum rolls in a book, I think, from 1973 or 4. Walter Phipps, Was Jesus Married? And he said the same thing, that the guy's a rabbi. We know the usual thing with rabbis was that they were married and so on. But you can't make a historical judgment based on a sociological judgment, right? Most rabbis thought this, so therefore Jesus must have thought so. This is kind of the Bill O'Reilly approach in killing Jesus. A lot of people, carpenters, worked in Sepphoris, so bingo, Jesus and his dad did too. There's no evidence for that. Plus, you got to keep in mind that according to our Jewish evidence, rabbi had not become a title until the very late 1st century, some 60 to 70 years after Jesus supposedly would have lived and died. So that the references to him as rabbi, as an address, seem to be anachronistic, as do some of the issues that he has shown debating over with the scribes. So he may not have been a rabbi, even if there was such a character. Plus, celibacy was well known in Judaism among the holiest, like the Essenes. Not all of them were, but they thought a great deal of celibacy in the same way 1 Corinthians 7 does. Not that there's anything wrong with sex, marriage, or children, but that if you're completely devoted to God, you just don't have time for domestic duties. Because if you are married, you do have those duties, and you better do them. I think that's a piece of real wisdom in 1 Corinthians 7. It's not that it's wrong to have a family. If you do, don't go spending all your time on God. You got a family, and God wants you to take care of them, pal. But if you feel the higher calling, don't get married and become a prophet or whatever. Given the kind of person Jesus is depicted as being, I would not assume at all that he had been married, or if he had been, given all this stuff. Now, all underlying this whole thing is the assumption that he really did and said some of these things, and ultimately, I think not, but, I don't want to rule out all interpretations. Assuming he did say some of this stuff, he was telling people that to follow him, they had to abandon their families. Well, in that case, he might have had one and abandoned them too. Impossible to say. Okay. Reuven says, my question concerns the ancestry of Israel according to the Bible. We're told through Abraham's rescue of Lot that he has at least 300 men at his disposal. All of these are circumcised with Abraham and are therefore under the covenant. What the author or authors of this story did not seem to realize is that this would imply that Abraham was not the sole ancestor of the Israelites, for surely these men contributed a lot more than one man to the ancestral makeup of the nation. Jacob's household later on seems to consist only of the core family and their servants. What happened to these other hundreds of men and their potential thousands of descendants? Yeah, that's an excellent point. Wouldn't they at least have been considered Hebrews, right? I mean, that's a larger category. Like when they refer to Abraham the Hebrew, they don't mean, they couldn't mean he's the only one, right? He fits into that group, and they're supposedly descended from Heber or Aber, who's an earlier character in the genealogy. So wouldn't there have been a larger covenant community? And so you couldn't trace everybody back to Father Abraham. I think that is an excellent, excellent point, Reuven. Whether there's a problem with Jacob as the channel for the chosen descendants, that's another matter. But of course there is a problem because the Old Testament treats it as if that they all are ultimately Abraham's progeny. That's not. This problem comes up with modern attempts to harmonize the Bible with evolution, when they say that, all right, the whole human race couldn't have come from one couple, Adam and Eve. Genetics wouldn't work that way. There must have been a whole bunch of first men and women, right? As evolution says, you're going to have like a generation of mutants along the line to speed up speciation. So there must have been a bunch of humanoid cavemen and so forth, and the favorable mutations made us more and more human. And so some appeal to that. Some Christians say, okay, the references to Adam and Eve and the fall of humanity really refer, maybe to Adam and Eve as king and queen of some early anthropoid civilization. But then you got a big problem, right? Because the whole business about original sin being passed down from one man and woman, logically, to everybody else comes into question. Did the others automatically get corrupted even though they were not direct descendants or cousins even of Adam and Eve? Oh boy. Same sort of a problem here, interestingly. But here the Bible itself sets up the problem, as you sharp-eyedly point out. Yeah. Let's see. Another one from the wise Reuven concerning Elohim and nature. In Hebrew, nature being hateva, or however you say it. I'm sorry, Hateva. In Hebrew, these words have the same gematria, number value. In other words, in the beginning of the creation of nature is not a verse reading without merit. What do you make of this? In the beginning, I think I'm missing an element of this. Oh, no, yeah, I got it. Yeah, God, instead of God created, nature was created. I gotta say, unlike you, I don't know Hebrew, but I'm suspicious of exegesis based on gematria. I think that is kind of a technique for embellishing the Bible. I would have to have more evidence that the ancients really did code this stuff into their text. It's not like differences in punctuation, right? In the Bible and the Quran, no vowels, and so you usually can tell what they must have intended, but occasionally somebody will point out, hey, if this had different vowels, it'd mean a different word, and the whole passage starts looking different. This isn't that, in my opinion. This is, let's add up the number value of the letters and see if we get... see if we can then divide the combined value among a different group of letters. Now, people can program that into their text, but boy, I really wonder. I'd need to see some solid evidence, of which perhaps I am simply ignorant, that they actually did that was a convention of writing and not just of reading, or should I say rereading. Let's see. And... let's see. Is this also from Reuben? I'm not sure. The typeface is similar. What are your thoughts on this quote from YouTuber Baud Bits? B-A-U-D Bits. Isaac Asimov hypothesized that the Hebrew tribe of Dinah was defiled, as the Bible says, by Canaanites at Shechem. The tribes of Simeon and Levi then avenged Dinah's defeat, but were themselves heavily mauled in the undertaking. Asimov supports this by the fact that the tribes of Simeon and Levi are later among the weakest of the tribes, with the Levites becoming priests rather than being noted as warriors. The fact that Jacob complains about the raid for fear of reprisals and beats a hasty retreat adds some credence to Asimov's hypothesis. Well, I'm really open to that because... And like as not, it's not originally his theory. Asimov wrote biblical books based on reading other people's commentaries, which is fine. He's sort of obviously, overtly a popularizer, and that's a good thing. But the idea that these individual patriarchs and matriarchs and so on represent tribes, groups, nations, clans. Oh yeah, that is certainly the case, as Hermann Gunkel showed. And so often these stories that star this or that individual, Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, are really thinly veiled accounts of how these groups get along or don't with each other in the writer or the storyteller's time. It's like a political cartoon almost. So I think that's not at all unlikely. My only quibble is that I don't think there's enough reason to think that Levi was originally a secular tribe, so to speak, and then later on became priests because they were too weak and wimpy. I think that we have at least 3 different accounts of what Levites were and where they came from in the Old Testament, and that is partly because some of the proposed origins were later considered heretical. I think with Ignaz Goldseer that the Levites must originally have been the temple priesthood of Nehushtan / Leviathan, and once that god was kicked out of the temple, then the origin of the Levites, who weren't all just kicked out, though they were demoted, it had to be changed. You couldn't say, yeah, this is the group of Levites, they used to worship a false god, and so I think the idea of a priestly tribe of Levi that originated as one of the branches of the descendants of Jacob, I think that's probably fiction. Ooh, let's see. Okay, David Oliver Smith, famous and ought to be even more so for his book Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Paul. Working on another one now, I think. He says, a few years ago, when I read Galatians 3:1, ... You foolish Galatians, who bewitched you? He's Uncle Arthur, after all. It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly exhibited as crucified. I thought that such a statement by Paul might refer to a passion play performed for early church audiences. However, I looked at the sentence in an interlinear Bible at BibleHub.com and found that the Greek for publicly exhibited is wait a minute, let me take a look at this. Proergraphe. Strong's Concordance points out that this is a combination of pro, before, and grapho, written, and typically means written in earlier times or before written. Strong does give an acceptable translation, gives as an acceptable translation publicly portrayed, and most modern translations have a version of that, as does the New Revised Standard Version quoted above. Isn't it obvious that Paul meant that at some point he demonstrated to the Galatians how his interpretation of Hebrew Scripture revealed that Christ was crucified, probably in Isaiah's suffering servant? Aren't the translators just fooling us by translating pro egraphe as publicly portrayed? Yeah, I have also heard that the word means something like placarded. That as if he was doing a chalk talk or something. But if he means pictured, that opens up the interesting theory of my student, Charles Ensminger, that he meant it was, like, because of other passages, that Christ was made evident in his flesh, in Paul's flesh, that this is an early reference, much earlier than we had otherwise, to stigmata. That he was the image of Christ crucified. That makes sense too. But this is really fascinating. And let me just take a look at that again. It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was... Do you need the element of demonstrated? That Christ was previously written as crucified? That strikes me as a little bit forced. I mean, Acts portrays Paul as reasoning from the Scriptures and showing that Jesus was the Christ. But does this say it? It seems to me it kind of misses an element. That did he show before their eyes before your eyes that Jesus Christ was written beforehand? I guess so. I was written beforehand as crucified. Yeah, I'll have to think about that, but that would make a lot of sense. Yeah, thanks, Dave. I got to think about that. I hope everybody else will, too. This guy's pretty sharp. I keep telling Dave every time we get together for pizza that he ought to go ahead and get the PhD that he deserves. Let's see. Okay, from Reed. He's from Richmond, Virginia. Let's see. Okay, I'm an undergraduate student in religious studies, focusing on the New Testament, with my sights on an eventual doctorate and professorship, but I'm still, as Paul would say, not yet among the teleoi, the mature, the perfect. I've been reading everything I can on the recent academic debate over a mythical Christ origin, and this, of course, has taken me through such wonderful material for and against as Your Incredible Shrinking Son of Man and Deconstructing Jesus, and Richard Carrier's Proven History and On the Historicity, etc. But did Jesus exist, and how Jesus became God, Earl Doherty's The Jesus Puzzle, etc., etc. While there's so much good research presented in these recent titles, many of them don't seem to meet academic standards held by certain professors who view them as popular rather than academic, as if those categories had no overlap. I cited Carrier's Historicity in a paper regarding the literary structures in the Aramaic chapters of Daniel, and was surprised to see that citation rebuffed by my professor, even after showing him that it was indeed an academic press publication submitted for peer review. Where might I find stronger sources to defend my agnosticism on the matter while I'm languishing in the pit that is undergraduate academia? I wish you a swift and painless death once the great old ones awake. Thank you, Reed. A consummation most devoutly to be wished. I think this is just bias. There's no way Carrier is some crackpot, some blogger like, what's his name? Oh my God! Come on, snap out of price. Morris Casey used to vilify Christ myth people. I mean that's it's. I think he's just taken this deductively derived slander that this is a crazy view, so anybody that holds it must be crazy. They can't really be educated, or they'd know this was nonsense, when in fact you kind of need to show why it's nonsense, and you also would kind of need to look over Carrier's work and see if you don't think he knows what he's talking about, because he sure does. I say, as a guy with 2 PhD degrees, he's a scholar. So is Earl Doherty. I don't know if Doherty has a kindergarten graduation certificate, but who the heck cares? Look at his book, as you have. Somebody ought to give him a doctorate on the basis of this book. He's in command of all this literature. He's in his living encyclopedia. The same thing with Acharya S., a.k.a. D.M. Murdoch. It's absurd the way these guys say, you hold such a view, you're an idiot. It's just ridiculous. But I would contact Richard and tell him this. I'm sure he'd get a pained, cringing kick out of it somehow. And he could lead you to other resources. Where did he come up with this, or has he read it elsewhere? I don't know. If the latter, all the better, because he could point you to that. But I think this is just like professors that give students bad grades because they don't like their politics. It's disgraceful, but probably not that uncommon. By the way, I just read a review from the Journal of Biblical Literature of my book, Deconstructing Jesus, and it's about what I would have expected, but oh boy, this guy rightly pointed out an incredibly stupid mistake I made, that I'm quoting this Markan saying, where he says, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and give his life a ransom for many. But stupid old Price got it wrong, and I said, therefore, the Son of Man did not come to serve, but to be served. Oh my God! How did I read through that thing a bunch of times? How did I miss it? Who knows? At least there's no such thing as price inerrancy. But that's what I would do. Contact Richard. Let's see. Okay, I guess I better sign off for today, and hopefully I'll be with you again soon. I appreciate your listening and your donating, I must admit. Always a little tough around here, so any support you can send my way, mighty handy. But in any event, keep sending in questions and I'll keep answering them. So see you next time on the Bible Geek.